It seems like video games go in trends. When a certain game is popular, others try to feed off its success. Like Pac-Man. How many maze games that look very similar to Pac-Man are there? Way too many. Look at Tetris too. I mean, there's a ton of Tetris-like games out there. You notice a trend? All these games were extremely popular, so it's only natural that others try to cash in on the idea. It even happens today. In fact, it's probably worse today than it ever has been with first-person shooters. But let's go back to 1991. A little game on the Sega Genesis was released that you might have heard of. Sonic the Hedgehog? Yeah, I thought that name might ring a bell. Well, Sonic was awesome. Both the character Sonic and the game Sonic. He was something never seen before. A cocky, blazing fast hedgehog. I mean, what's better? Sonic was a massive hit and a huge part of Sega's success. It was soon after that games just started to feed right off Sonic's idea. How does that old saying go? Imitation is the biggest flattery? Something like that. Well, apparently video game developers in the 90s have that motto posted all over the damn wall. After Sonic's release, a ton of games featuring animal mascots started running hot off the presses. Now, I'm not saying they're all bad, and some actually are decent, but overwhelming majorities are just bleh. Like Bubsy. It was alright, but it couldn't hold a candle to Sonic. There was one, however, that really stood out as a great game. Rocket Knight Adventures. Rocket Knight Adventures was a take by Konami on the whole mascot trend, and this game broke the norm because it wasn't just your run-of-the-mill platformer. It was awesome. It even gave Sonic a run for his money, though it probably wasn't quite as good. I won't go into much detail about this game, but you control a character named Sparkster. He's a Rocket Knight, whatever that is. And he's also a possum. So Sparkster has the ability to charge up his rocket and launch in any direction. He also uses the ability to kill enemies in an effort to rescue the princess. A little cliche, but it works. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's a Genesis classic that you should definitely check out. Now, Rocket Knight Adventure did have a sequel on the Genesis called Sparkster. An odd name, I think. It did have a subtitle called Rocket Knight Adventures 2, though. I've never played Sparkster on the Genesis, but I have heard it's not quite as good as Rocket Knight Adventures. But there was also a Sparkster game released on the Super Nintendo, and this one I have played. One thing I should clear up, though, is that Sparkster on Genesis is Rocket Knight Adventure 2. Sparkster on the Super Nintendo isn't related, and kind of could be considered more of a spin-off. So the bottom line is, it's not the same game as Sparkster on the Genesis. But how is it? Is it better than Rocket Knight Adventures on the Genesis? Well, it's hard to say, so let's take a look. For me, it's hard to beat the classics, and like I said, Rocket Knight Adventures is a classic. Sparkster gives a great effort to be like Rocket Knight Adventures, and for the most part it is, but I think overall it might lack the charm that gives it the name classic. Now don't get me wrong, Sparkster is a great game. In fact, the graphics really caught my attention. They are excellent. The original Rocket Knight has some nice visuals, but these are just great. I mean, let's look at Rocket Knight on the Genesis, and now look at Sparkster. Much, much more vibrant and colorful. It is a Konami game, though, so that usually means that the graphics are top-notch. But it also means that the game is usually difficult. And while Sparkster isn't a super challenge, it is kind of tough. Sometimes I feel like you get killed in very cheap ways by an enemy that just takes out your entire life in one hit. Usually it's because you've been crushed or something like that, but it still seems a little severe to take your entire life in the blink of an eye. It does help, though, that Sparkster has some sharp controls. The B button is jump, the Y button is attack, the L button and R button cause Sparkster to do a little dash attack to the left or right, depending on which one you push. The other buttons aren't used. Now, what set Rocket Knight apart from other generic platformers was the ability of Sparkster to charge his rockets up and blast in any direction. The same is true for this game. You hold the Y button for around 2 seconds and you have the ability to blast in any direction, depending on which direction you point the D-pad. If you don't pick a direction, he'll just do a spin attack in the air. The control scheme works pretty well, although sometimes it can be confusing when there are a lot of enemies around. Sparkster also allows for some unique platforming. Sometimes you'll have to ricochet off the walls to reach higher places in new areas. It keeps it from being completely linear all the time. Something I also didn't mention before is that the music is sweet. It's kind of like another Konami staple. Each Konami game tends to have awesome music. I'm especially a fan of the music in the level Steelworks. It's awesome. Overall, I only have a few gripes. Like I said before, you can die in the blink of an eye if you're not careful, and most of the time it feels cheap. You never really see it coming. Also, when there's a lot of sprites on the screen, the game endures a little slowdown. It's not bad, but it does happen. My last gripe is an odd one. I know that in order to make a game more fun, the levels should all seem different, and they do, but it seems like as one level ends, you're just randomly dropped into a new world. It comes off a little weird when you're playing, but it's not a big deal. Overall, Sparkster on the Super Nintendo is a fun action platformer that I would recommend to anyone. It can be a little on the pricey side sometimes, so be prepared for that, but I'd say it's money well spent. Sparkster does lack the charm that made Rocket Knight a classic on the Genesis, but I can't help but praise Konami for staying true to the series with some nice additions. I'll give Sparkster an 8 out of 10. I would also like to wish everybody a happy holiday. Also like to wish everybody a happy holidays and a Merry Christmas. Take care.